They called me crazy for building a tomb on this mountain. But when the blizzard hit, my tomb was the only thing keeping them alive.
They called him crazy, said that stone ceiling would crush him in his sleep. The building inspector tried 3 times to shut it down. The whole town laughed when he hauled granite blocks up that mountain alone for 11 months straight. A homeless veteran, a scarred German shepherd, building something that looked more like a tomb than a home. Then the blizzard came. The kind that flattens trailers and buries highways, the kind that kills, and 48 hours later the same people who called him insane stood in their pajamas at his door, half frozen, holding their children. Jax Harlan opened it without a single word. Before we continue, tell us in the comments where you're watching from today. The trailer was a 28-foot Airstream that had not moved under its own power in 9 years. And Jax Harlan had paid $800 cash for it from a widow in Great Falls who had told him, with a kind of weary mercy in her voice, that her husband would have wanted it to go to a man who needed it more than money. It sat now at the bottom of his 40 acres in Blackfoot County, Montana, tucked into a stand of lodgepole pine that broke the wind coming down off the Rockies but did nothing to muffle the cold. The aluminum skin was dented along the passenger side from a deer strike before he ever owned it. The roof had been patched twice with roofing tar that had hardened into black scabs. Inside, the propane heater coughed and rattled every 20 minutes through the long October nights, and Jax had learned to sleep through the rattle the way a man learns to sleep through anything, by letting it become part of his bones. Smokey lay across the foot of the bunk on a folded woolen blanket the colour of dried blood, her amber eyes half closed but never fully shut. Her thick double coat rising and falling with the slow patient rhythm of an animal that had spent 5 years of her life learning never to truly sleep. The bunk was barely wide enough for the 2 of them. Jax slept along the wall with his right arm resting on her flank, and somewhere in the small hours of every morning, when the heater fell silent and the cold pressed against the aluminum walls like a hand, Smokey would shift her weight half an inch closer to him, and the warmth of her body against his ribs was the only thing that kept him moored in this world. The trailer smelled like motor oil and pine resin and the specific dry chalk smell of cut limestone, because the small folding table at the front was buried under stone samples he had been studying for the better part of a year, pieces of granite, chunks of field stone he had hauled up from the creek bed below the property line, a single fragment of weathered limestone, the size of his fist that he had carried through 3 deployments, and that he kept now on top of a leather-bound notebook with a cracked spine, like a paperweight, like a relic. He had not slept well, not truly, not deeply, he never did. The Airstream sat at 5,100 feet of elevation, and the wind that came off the saddle of Wolf Ridge had teeth in it even in early autumn, and every time the propane heater shut off the cold would slide down the inside of the aluminum walls and settle on the blankets like a second body. He woke in increments. First the shoulders, then the hands, then the long old ache in his lower back where a piece of shrapnel the size of a pencil eraser still rode against his spine because the surgeons had told him, in a voice that was supposed to sound reassuring, that taking it out would do more damage than leaving it in. At 4:30 in the morning he sat up on the edge of the bunk and pressed the heels of his palms against his eyes until the small dancing lights behind them faded into the dim brown blur of the trailer's interior. Smokey lifted her head. She watched him without moving. Her ears tracked his breathing the way another dog might track a squirrel. When he stood, she stood soundless, her nails not even clicking against the linoleum because she had learned years ago in a place neither of them spoke about anymore, that nails clicking on hard floors could be the difference between a man coming home and a man not coming home. He pulled on his jeans. The military surplus jacket was draped over the propane heater because that was the only way to make it warm enough to bear against his skin in the morning, and the cuffs of the sleeves were fraying badly now, the olive drab thread unravelling where his wrists had rubbed against them 10,000 times. He worked his arms through the sleeves and felt the familiar weight settle across his shoulders. The jacket had been with him longer than his marriage had been. The jacket was still here. He filled the percolator from the 5-gallon water jug that lived strapped to the outside of the trailer, and he set it on the small camp stove, and he stood for a long minute with both hands flat against the counter, while the blue flame caught and the water began to tick toward boiling. Outside the small frosted window, the stars were still hard and white over Wolf Ridge. Inside the trailer there was only the hiss of the burner and the slow, patient breathing of his dog. The coffee can sat on the highest shelf above the bunk behind a stack of folded shirts. It was a Folgers can, red, the label faded almost white from sun and time, and the lid was held on by a rubber band Jax had cut from the inner tube of a bicycle tire. He did not take it down often. He did not need to. He could have catalogued every object inside it in the dark with his eyes closed, and on the worst nights, when something inside his head would not let him be, he sometimes did exactly that. The mental inventory was a kind of prayer, a kind of suturing. Inside the can there was a wedding band, plain and gold, the inside engraved with the date June 14th, 2009. There was a key to a house in Bakersfield, California, that he no longer owned. There was a folded sheet of paper from the Kern County Superior Court, dated and stamped, declaring the dissolution of his marriage to Lena Marie Harlan, formerly Lena Marie Castile. There was a photograph of his mother holding him at 6 months old, and the back of the photograph had her handwriting on it, faded blue ink, that said, "My brave little man." And there was one other thing. He did not look at the other thing often. He poured the coffee black into a tin mug, and he sat at the folding table and he opened the leather-bound notebook with the cracked spine. The pages were warped from old water damage, and the ink in places had bled to a soft grey, but the drawings were still clear enough to read. They were not his drawings, they were his brother's. His brother had drawn them in pencil during the long nights in the firebase, when there was nothing to do but wait for the sun to come up or the next thing to happen, and his brother had said one night across the small chemical lantern between their cots, "If I ever build a place to live in, Harlan, I'm going to build it like that monastery we saw at Banja Luka. Stone vault, no nails. Holds the heat in winter, holds the cool in summer, lasts 1,000 years. A man could die in a place like that and feel he had lived somewhere real." His brother had not lived to build it. His brother had died in a province whose name Jax could not bring himself to say out loud anymore. And there were things about the way it had happened that Jax had carried home in a place inside his chest that did not have a name. And the notebook with the drawings of the stone vault was the only thing left of the man who had been more brother to him than any man who had shared his blood. The notebook was the reason Jax had bought the 40 acres. The notebook was the reason for everything Jax was now doing on this mountain. He closed the notebook and pressed his palm flat against the leather cover for a long moment, the way another man might lay his hand on a coffin lid. And then he slid the notebook back into its place on the shelf beside the coffee can, and he went outside to begin the day's work. The cold hit him at the door the way a slap hits. The thermometer nailed to the side of the trailer read 18 degrees. There was a thin layer of frost over everything, the kind of frost that has weight to it, that does not blow off in the wind, and his boots crunched it under their soles as he walked the worn path up the slope toward the cabin. Smoky paced him on his left side at exactly the heel position, her breath steaming in small white plumes that drifted past his elbow. The path was 40 yards long and steep enough that he had cut switchbacks into it with a shovel through the summer to keep from breaking his back hauling materials. He had hauled every stone in the cabin up that path on his own shoulders. He had counted them once and stopped counting at 400, and stopped trying to remember after that. The cabin sat on a flat shelf of granite bedrock he had cleared himself, 20 feet by 24 feet, the walls now standing 4 courses high, in fitted fieldstone bonded with a lime mortar he mixed in 5-gallon buckets one batch at a time. The doorframe was set. The window openings were framed with heavy oak lintels he had milled himself from a fallen ponderosa down by the creek. The roof was the thing that had not yet been done. The roof was the thing the whole town said could not be done. The roof was the reason a man named Vance Crowley had driven the 11 miles of switchback gravel road from Pinedale to this property 3 separate times already to tell Jax Harlan that what he was attempting to build was insane. A barrel vault stone, 34 inches of thermal mass at the crown, built in 4 ribs of cut granite voussoirs over a temporary wooden centering form that Jax had constructed in pieces inside the trailer and assembled at the site. No steel, no engineered lumber, no truss. Nothing the modern eye recognized as load-bearing. Just stone fitted to stone, the way it had been done in the country where his brother had drawn the pictures. The way it had been done before, there was a word for the country where his brother had drawn the pictures. The way it had been done since the Romans understood that a stone in compression will hold up the sky. He stood at the threshold of the half-finished cabin and let his eyes move across the work. Smoky sat at his right side and let her eyes do the same thing. The first ring of voussoirs along the eastern arch was complete. The wooden centering for the second arch was set in place, but the stones had not yet been hung on it. He had 31 days by his own calculation before the snow came in earnest. He had $840 left in his bank account. He had one dog, he had no help, he had no other plan. He went to the work. The lime mortar in the bucket had skinned over during the night, and he chipped the skin away with the edge of the trowel and stirred the rest until it ran the right slow way off the metal. He set the first stone of the morning. It weighed 68 pounds. He fitted it against its neighbour by feel as much as by sight, and when it sat right his hands knew before his eyes did, the way a man's hands know the right click of a magazine seating into a rifle, the way a man's hands know the difference between a body that is breathing and a body that is not. He troweled the mortar into the joint and struck the surface flush, and stepped back and waited for the small, subtle shift that would tell him the stone had not seated. The shift did not come. The stone held. Smoky lay down 10 feet from the work, her chin on her front paws, her amber eyes tracking him through the slow, careful movements of the morning. She did not bark. She had not barked in 9 years. Her vocal cords still worked, but the bark had gone out of her in the same place where so much had gone out of Jack's, and her silence was not damage but discipline, a thing she had chosen for herself the way a monk chooses a vow. He worked through the morning without speaking. He set 6 stones. Each one took him between 30 and 40 minutes. The sun came up over Wolf Ridge at 7:14, and the temperature climbed to 23 degrees by 10, and the frost on the granite bedrock turned to a thin film of damp that he had to wipe off each stone with a rag before he set it. He drank water from a metal canteen. He ate a single hard-boiled egg from his pocket. He thought about nothing he could have put into words. At 11:30 he heard a vehicle on the gravel road. A diesel engine, 3/4 ton, working hard against the grade. He set down the trowel without hurrying, and he turned his head no more than 2 inches, and Smoky was already on her feet, her ears forward, her body angled toward the bend in the road where the truck would emerge in another 40 seconds. The two of them stood like that without moving, a man and a dog, and the only sound was the wind in the pines and the distant labour of an engine climbing toward them. The town did not come up here often. When it did, it never came for any reason that was good. The truck that came up the gravel road was a white municipal pickup, a 2018 F-250 with the seal of Blackfoot County stenciled in faded blue on the door panel and a light bar on the cab that had been disconnected for so long that wasps had built a nest inside the housing. Vance Crowley drove it the way he did everything, with both hands tight on the wheel at 10 and 2. And his jaw set as if the steering itself were a personal grievance. He parked it crossways at the head of the path, blocking the only way down off the property, and for a long moment he sat behind the wheel and stared at Jax through the windshield without moving. Jax did not move either. He stood beside the half-built arch with the trowel in his right hand, his left hand resting flat against the cool stone of the second voussoir he had set that morning. And he let his eyes go to the soft middle distance the way a man does when he wants to read everything in a scene without committing to anything in it. Smoky stood 3 feet behind his right calf. Her body was oriented toward the truck. Her ears were forward but flat, not raised, the specific configuration she used when she had not yet decided whether the thing in front of her was a threat or only an inconvenience. Crowley got out. He was a tall man, 53 years old, with a slight stoop in the shoulders that came from 40 years of leaning over engineering plans in poorly lit county offices, and he wore a tan canvas barn jacket over a plaid flannel shirt that had been laundered so many times the colours had gone soft. He walked up the path with a clipboard tucked under his arm and a roll of orange sticker tape in his right hand. And when he stopped exactly 12 feet from Jax, the distance a man chooses when he wants to stay outside arm's reach without making the decision look deliberate. Mr. Harlan. Jax nodded once. "This is the 3rd time I've been up here." Jax nodded again. "You've ignored both prior notices." Jax did not nod this time. He rested the trowel across the top of the bucket, careful not to drop the working face into the mortar, and he turned his body a quarter turn so that he was facing Crowley directly, a courtesy and a signal both, and he waited. He had learned long ago that most men, when given silence, would fill it with the truth of what they had come to say. Crowley was not different from most men. "That ceiling is going to come down," Crowley said. "I've had 2 engineers look at the photographs you submitted. Neither one will sign off. Neither one will even look me in the eye when they hand the file back. You understand what that means?" "Ah, son." Jax did not answer. The word son hung in the cold air between them like something neither man had asked to be there. "It means," Crowley said, "that when it comes down, and it will come down, and it kills you, this office is going to have to file paperwork explaining why we did not stop you. And I'm tired. Mr. Harlan. I'm tired of filing paperwork on dead men who were warned." Smokey shifted half an inch closer to Jax's leg. Her ears stayed flat. She did not growl. She did not need to. Crowley's eyes flicked down to the dog and back up. "She still under control?" "Always," Jax said. It was the first word he had spoken aloud in 2 days. Crowley unrolled 6 inches of orange tape from his roll. "I'm not red tagging you today. Not yet, but I'm telling you for the 3rd and final time. You are building a structure that no engineer in the state of Montana will certify. You will not pass a final inspection. You will not be granted a certificate of occupancy. And if I find out you are sleeping in that thing once the roof goes up, I'm personally going to drive up here with the sheriff and pull you out by your collar." He waited for Jax to argue. Jax did not argue. He waited for Jax to apologize. Jax did not apologize. After a long moment, Crowley made a small sound in his throat that was not quite a laugh and not quite a curse, and he turned and walked back down the path to his truck, and he sat behind the wheel for another long moment before he started the engine, and then he backed and turned and drove down the gravel road and out of sight beyond the bend in the pines. The diesel rattle faded. The wind in the lodgepoles came back. The cold settled. Jax let out a breath he had not been aware of holding. Smokey's ears lifted half an inch back into their normal carriage, and she walked once around his ankles in a slow circle, the small grounding ritual she did after every encounter that had carried the chemistry of conflict, and then she sat at his right side and looked up at him with the patient question in her amber eyes that he had learned to read better than he had ever learned to read another human being. He picked up the trowel. He set the next stone. He worked until 2 in the afternoon, and then he washed his hands in the basin he kept on a wooden stool by the trailer, and he and Smokey climbed into the cab of the old Ford F-150 he had owned since before his marriage. The truck was a 2003 dark green, the paint oxidized to a matte chalk on the hood, the bench seat patched with silver duct tape, the odometer showing 248,000 miles and counting. Smokey took her place on the passenger side, with her front paws on the dash and her chin lowered to watch the road. Jax turned the key. The engine caught on the 3rd try. Pinedale was 11 miles down the mountain on County Road 14, and the road was paved for the last 3 miles only, and the rest was a graded gravel switchback that he could have driven in his sleep by now. The town sat in a small bowl at the foot of the ridge, 642 souls according to the last census. A single main street 4 blocks long, a post office, a feed store, a hardware, a bar, a diner, a Baptist church, a Methodist church, a small medical clinic that was open 3 days a week, and a gas station with 2 pumps on the highway side where everyone who passed through stopped because the next gas was 91 miles north. He needed 200 pounds of Type N lime mortar mix. He needed a box of 3/8-inch lag bolts. He needed a quart of 2-cycle oil for the chainsaw. He needed dog food for Smokey. He needed coffee. He had budgeted himself $37 for the trip and not $1 more. The bell over the door of Pinedale Hardware made its small flat sound when he pushed through, and the 4 men who had been gathered around the wood stove at the back of the store all looked up at once, and then all looked away at once. And the gesture was so synchronized and so practiced that it might have been choreographed. Jax did not let it land on him. He had been on the receiving end of that particular shared glance for most of a year now. He had stopped feeling it the way a man stops feeling a watch on his wrist after he has worn it long enough. The owner was a woman in her late 60s named May Holloway, who had run the store since her husband died of a stroke behind the counter in 2011. She was the only person in town who had ever spoken to Jax with anything that resembled neutrality. She rang up his order without small talk, and she watched him load it into the bed of the truck through the front window without looking away when he caught her gaze. And when he came back inside to pay, she handed him his change in an even stack of bills laid flat across his palm. $12.43. He had come in under budget. "Thank you." "Ma'am," he said. "Cold one coming," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "They're saying Tuesday. I heard. You ready?" He looked at her. He was unaccustomed to the directness of a question without judgment riding on top of it. "I will be." She nodded once, the way men nodded at one another, and she turned back to the ledger she had been working on, and that was the end of it. He pulled the truck around to the gas station to fill the tank. The pumps were old, the kind with the spinning analog dial that clicked over each gallon, and the fuel was 11 cents a gallon more than it would have been in Great Falls, but the next gas was 91 miles north, and everybody in Pindale knew the math. He set the nozzle in the fill spout and stood with his back to the wind, and his hand resting on the cold metal of the truck bed, and that was when he noticed the woman. She was at the second pump, on the far side, and she was struggling to get the cap off the gas tank of a small grey Honda Civic that had a child seat visible through the rear window. She wore a long dark green wool coat that looked second-hand, and a knit hat the colour of oatmeal pulled low over her ears, and her gloves were the cheap polyester kind that were sold in 2 packs at the gas station counter. Her shoulders were thin and tight, her breath came in small white clouds. There was a boy in the back seat, maybe 7 years old, his face pressed to the side window with the unself-conscious curiosity of a child watching the world without understanding, yet that the world was watching him back. She got the cap off. She pumped $12 exactly into the tank. She set the nozzle back. She got into the driver's seat. She turned the key. The engine gave 1 weak revolution and died. She tried again. It did not even turn over the second time. The starter made a single dry click and then nothing at all. Jax saw her shoulders rise toward her ears. He saw her left hand come up and press flat against her mouth for a moment and then drop. He saw her look in the rearview mirror at the boy and arrange her face into something that was supposed to be reassuring before she turned around and said something to him that Jax could not hear. The boy nodded. She turned back to the steering wheel and tried the key again. Nothing. Smokey was watching the woman through the windshield of Jax's truck. Her ears were forward and high, the carriage of curiosity rather than threat, and her tail thumped once against the bench seat in a way that Jax had not seen her do in a very long time. He glanced at her. The dog held the woman's car in her gaze with a steadiness that was not normal. He closed the gas cap on his own truck. He put the receipt in his shirt pocket. He walked across the apron of the gas station with his hands loose at his sides and his pace deliberately slow, so that the woman would see him coming with enough time to decide whether she wanted him to come closer. She saw him in her side mirror. She rolled her window down 2 inches. "Ma'am," he said. He stopped 6 feet from the door. "Looks like it's not catching." "It's the starter," she said. Her voice was tired. "Or the alternator." "I don't know. It's been doing this." "Pop the hood. I can have a look." She hesitated. He waited. He did not move closer. She glanced at the boy in the back seat and then at Smokey, who was watching from the cab of his truck with her front paws on the dash, and something in the dog's posture seemed to settle the woman in a way Jax did not understand and did not ask about. She reached down and pulled the hood release. He raised the hood and propped it. The engine bay was in better order than he had expected. Someone had recently changed the spark plug wires. The battery terminals were clean. He went down on one knee on the cold concrete and laid 2 fingers on the starter solenoid and asked her to try the key. She tried. He felt nothing. No click, no draw. He stood and tested the battery posts with the back of his pocket knife. and the post came back with the dull non-spark of a battery whose voltage had dropped below the threshold to crank the engine. "Battery's gone," he said. "It's not the starter. Can it be jumped?" "It can. Won't last. You'll need a new one within the week." "I know," she said. "I know I do." He went back to his truck and pulled the jumper cables out from behind the seat. He hooked them up the way he had hooked up jumper cables 100 times in his life, red to red and black to a clean ground, and he started his own engine and let it run for 2 minutes before he asked her to try the key again. The Honda caught on the first turn. The boy in the back seat clapped his hands once, the small uncomplicated joy of a child watching a small good thing happen, and the woman closed her eyes for 1 second and then opened them and looked at Jax through the open driver's window. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. "How much do I owe you?" "Nothing." She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folded $10 bill anyway, and held it out toward him. Her hand was shaking slightly, from cold or from something else. He looked at the bill. He looked at her face. The hand that held the bill had a thin bracelet on the wrist, just visible at the cuff of her glove, and the bracelet was made of small flat metal tags that caught the light in a way Jax recognized instantly without yet registering what he was recognizing. "Keep it," he said. "Get the boy something warm." She lowered the bill. Her eyes held his for a beat longer than was comfortable for either of them. And then she folded the bill back into her pocket, and she nodded the way May Holloway had nodded inside the hardware store. And she rolled up her window, and she pulled out of the gas station and turned east on the highway and was gone. Jax stood at the pump for a long moment after she had gone. Smokey was still watching the road where the Honda had disappeared, her amber eyes tracking the empty space where the car had been. Her tail thumped once more against the bench seat. Then she turned and looked at Jax through the windshield, and the expression on her face was not curiosity, and was not warning, but something he had seen perhaps 4 times in their 9 years together. Recognition, the small, unmistakable signal that an animal makes when she has placed a scent or a face or a voice in the file where it belongs, and the file is one she did not expect to open again. He drove home up the mountain. The cold was deeper now. The light was already going. By the time he reached the trailer it was 4:50, and the sun had dropped behind Wolf Ridge and the temperature had fallen to 14 degrees, and he sat for a long time in the cab of the truck with the engine off and his hands on the wheel and his dog beside him, watching the half-built cabin take on the silver-blue colour of a thing the world had not yet decided what to do with. He went up the path with the bag of mortar mix on his shoulder. He set it inside the doorway. He came back down. He went up again with the lag bolts and the chainsaw oil. He came back down. On the 3rd trip up he stopped at the door of the cabin and he looked at the wooden centering arch waiting for its stones, and he said aloud, to the dog and to the mountain and to the brother who was not there, "I'm going to finish this." Smokey's tail thumped once against the granite threshold. He went back down for the dog food and the coffee, and when he came up the 3rd time he started the work again. In the dark, by the light of the camp lantern hung from a nail driven into the oak lintel above the door, and he did not stop until the propane in the lantern ran out 4 hours later. The second visit from the county came on a Thursday morning, 3 days after the gas station, and this time Vance Crowley brought 2 other men with him. The first was the sheriff, Tom Beaumont, a heavy-set man in his early 60s who had held the office in Blackfoot County since before Jax was born, and who wore the badge with the air of a man who had long ago made peace with the fact that 90% of his job consisted of serving paperwork and waiting for people to die of natural causes. The second man Jax did not know. He was younger than the other 2, maybe 40, in a navy blue puffer jacket and a pair of expensive boots that had clearly not been chosen for the kind of road that led to this property, and he carried a leather portfolio under one arm with the focused purposefulness of a man who billed by the quarter hour. They came up the path together in a loose triangle, Crowley in the lead, the engineer half a step behind him on his right, the sheriff bringing up the rear with his thumbs hooked into his duty belt and his eyes moving over the cabin in slow, careful sweeps. Smokey had heard the trucks on the road 4 full minutes before the men reached the work site, and she had positioned herself, without prompting and without hurry, on the granite bedrock to the right of the cabin door, sitting upright with her front paws together and her ears in the high alert carriage. She did not growl. She did not need to. The carriage of her body told everything anyone needed to know about the state of the situation. Jax was on the centering arch when they arrived, 16 feet up, fitting the 11th voussoir of the morning into its place with both hands, while his right knee braced the weight against the wooden form, and he held the stone where it was for a 5 count after he heard their boots on the path, because he could not let go of it until the mortar had taken its first set, or the entire morning's work would slide off the centering and crash to the floor below. Crowley waited. The engineer waited. The sheriff cleared his throat once. Jax let the stone go when the mortar told him it was ready, and he wiped his hands on a rag tucked into his back pocket, and he came down off the centering on the cleated pine ladder he had built for the purpose, and he stood at the door of the cabin with his back to the morning sun and his face in shadow. "Mr. Harlan," Crowley said. "Inspector, this is John Pelletier, structural engineer with the firm we contract through, out of Bozeman. The county brought him up to give us a formal opinion." Pelletier extended a hand. Jax took it. The handshake was brief and exact and gave nothing away on either side. "Mr. Harlan," Pelletier said, "I'd like to take a look at your work, if you'll permit me." "Look as long as you want." The engineer set his portfolio down on the granite bedrock and unzipped it and produced a small laser measuring device and a digital camera and a pad of graph paper, and he went to work with the same kind of methodical patience that Jax had been bringing to the stones themselves. And there was something in the quality of his focus that Jax respected in spite of himself. He stood back. Smokey stood back. Crowley and the sheriff stood back. For 28 minutes the engineer measured and photographed and made notes, and the only sounds were the shutter of his camera and the soft thump of the laser device's small electronic register and the wind in the pines. When he was finished, he zipped his portfolio closed and stood up and brushed the granite dust off the knees of his pants, and he looked at the cabin and at Jax and at the cabin again, and then he walked the 12 feet across the bedrock to where the 3 of them were standing, and he laid his portfolio against his thigh. "Mr. Harlan, yes, I won't mince words. The construction technique you are using is what we would call a Romanesque barrel vault. It's not unknown. It was used extensively in southern Europe and the Levant for about 1400 years before the development of the pointed Gothic arch, and then later the steel I-beam made it functionally obsolete. It works when it's done correctly. It works extremely well. Stone compression has nearly unlimited compressive strength, and a properly cut voussoir distributes load through the arch to the abutments in a way that has, historically speaking, outlasted almost every other form of roof we know about." He paused. Jax waited. "The problem," Pelletier said, "is the correctly part. There are perhaps 15 masons in the United States today who are qualified to construct a true compression vault without engineered formwork and steel reinforcement. 2 of them are at MIT. The rest are in the National Cathedral's restoration program in Washington. None of them are in the state of Montana, and none of them, with all due respect, are an unlicensed individual working alone on a remote piece of land in Blackfoot County, without any peer review of the specifications. I have specifications. From where?" Jax did not answer for a moment. He looked at the engineer's face, and the face was not unkind, and that surprised him more than he would have expected. "From a Bosnian Orthodox monk named Brother Stefan, who let my fire team spend 3 nights in his monastery in the winter of 2010 because the road back to base was blocked. He was 81 years old. The monastery was built in 1192. He gave my brother a tour of the kitchen vault and explained the geometry. My brother wrote it all down in a notebook. I have the notebook." The engineer's face did something subtle. "May I see it?" "It's in the trailer." "I'll get it." He went down the path. He came back up with the leather notebook in his hands. He handed it to Pelletier. The engineer took it the way a man takes a child handed to him at a hospital, both palms up, careful, slow. He opened it. He turned the pages one by one. He stopped at the page with the sectional drawing of the vault and the small handwritten notes in the margins, and he stayed on that page for a long time. And when he looked up, his expression had changed. "Who drew these?" he said. "My brother." "Your brother is a structural engineer." "My brother was a Marine. His name was Daniel Walsh. He was killed in Helmand in November of 2011. The engineer was silent for a long moment. He turned another page. He turned another. He came back to the sectional drawing. The geometry on this is correct, he said. The catenary curve, the rise-to-span ratio, the voussoir cuts. Whoever drew this understood arch theory at a level that most working engineers do not. I don't know how a Marine knew this. He read everything, Jax said. He was that kind of man. Crowley had been silent through the entire exchange. He shifted his weight now and cleared his throat. John, where does this leave us? Pelletier handed the notebook back to Jax. He took his time about it. He looked at the cabin for another long moment. Then he turned to Crowley with a careful expression that Jax could not quite read. Vance, he said, I can't sign off on this. The county can't issue an occupancy permit on a structure built without licensed engineering oversight, and I won't put my license against it even if the math is right. Because the math being right on paper doesn't mean the execution is right in stone. But I also can't tell you it's going to fall down. I won't tell you that. Because if this man has done what these drawings describe, and if he has done it as carefully as it appears he has done it, that vault could stand for 1,000 years. Then what am I supposed to do with him? That's not my call. That's a county matter. I'm telling you what I can certify and what I can't. I can't certify. I also can't condemn. Crowley's jaw tightened. The sheriff scratched at the back of his neck. None of them looked at Jax. There's a town meeting tonight, Crowley said finally. 7 o'clock at the church. The county commissioners are going to be there. So is May Holloway and the rest of the Merchants Association. We're going to talk about you, Mr. Harlan, whether you come or not. I'd advise you to come. Jax nodded once. The 3 men walked back down the path to their trucks. The engines started. The trucks turned and went back down the gravel road. Smokey shifted her weight and let her ears come back down to a normal carriage and walked once around Jax's ankles in the slow grounding circle. Jax went back up the ladder. He worked through the afternoon. He set 14 more stones. The eastern arch was now 18 voussoirs complete out of the 23 it would take to close. And the keystone he had cut for that arch sat wrapped in oiled canvas at the foot of the ladder waiting. He did not let himself look at it. Looking at the keystone too early was a way of getting ahead of the work, and getting ahead of the work was a way of making mistakes, and mistakes in compression masonry were the kind of mistakes that did not give a man a second chance. At 6:15 he washed the lime dust off his hands and forearms in the basin, and he changed his shirt for the cleaner of the 2 shirts he owned, and he put on the surplus jacket and his cleaner pair of jeans. And he and Smokey drove down the mountain to Pinedale. The Methodist church basement was lit by fluorescent tubes that hummed at a pitch he had spent 20 years training himself not to hear, and the room was full to standing along the back wall, which was a thing Jax had not expected. He had thought there might be 12 people, 15 at most. There were closer to 100. The folding chairs were all taken. The Merchants Association was at the front table along with the 3 county commissioners and Vance Crowley and the sheriff. The room went quiet by degrees as Jax came through the door, the silence rippling outward from where he stood in the doorway like a stone dropped in a pond, until the only sound was the fluorescent hum and the small distant cough of someone in the 3rd row. He took Smokey off her leash and gave her the small hand signal that meant down. Stay, and she lay flat in the corner by the door with her chin on her front paws, and her amber eyes did not leave him for the next 43 minutes. He stood at the back of the room. He did not take a chair. He did not need one. The meeting moved through other items first: snowplow contracts, a grant for the volunteer fire department, the hours of the post office over the holidays. Then Crowley stood and took the floor, and he laid out the situation about Jax Harlan in a voice that was more measured than Jax had been expecting, and he ended by asking the commissioners to consider whether the county should take legal action to halt construction. A man Jax did not know stood up in the 2nd row. If he's on his own land and not endangering anyone else, what business is it of ours? He's endangering himself, Crowley said. That's his right. A woman in the 4th row. I drive past that property twice a week to my sister's place. That thing looks like it's going to come down on his head. It's been going up for 11 months and it hasn't come down yet. Another voice. From the back. He's a homeless veteran. The county shouldn't be hassling him. He's not homeless. He owns the land. He's living in a trailer without a permit. Lots of people live in trailers without permits. We don't run them out of the county for it. The argument moved back and forth like that for 15 minutes, the room dividing itself along lines Jax could read but did not feel a part of. In the 3rd row from the back, on the aisle, he saw the woman from the gas station. She was sitting with her back very straight, and her hands folded in her lap and the boy beside her, and she did not look at Jax once, but her presence in the room was a thing Jax was aware of in the same low background way that a man on patrol is aware of the position of the sun. The bracelet was on her wrist. She was wearing it openly tonight, no glove. The small flat metal tags resting against the cuff of a blue cotton sweater. Jax could not see the engraving from where he stood. One of the commissioners cleared his throat and asked Mr. Harlan whether he had anything he wished to say. Jax stepped forward 2 paces. Not all the way to the table, just enough that the room could see him without straining. "My name is Jax Harlan," he said. "I served 12 years in the United States Army. I was honorably discharged in 2017. I bought this land legally. I am paying my property taxes. I am not in violation of any building code that the county has the authority to enforce on a structure that I do not intend to sell or rent or insure. I am building a home. I will live in it alone with my dog. If it falls down, it falls on me. That is the only deal I'm asking this room to honor." He stopped. He waited. The fluorescent lights hummed. A chair creaked somewhere. The commissioner who had spoken first nodded slowly. He looked at the other 2 commissioners. They looked at Crowley. Crowley looked at the floor. The sheriff did not look at anyone. May Holloway, in her chair at the merchant's table, lifted her chin half an inch and held it there, and that gesture, more than any vote that was about to be taken, was the gesture Jax knew how to read. The motion to take legal action failed 3-0. The motion to issue a stop work order failed 3-0. The commissioner thanked Mr. Harlan for coming. Jax nodded once and he turned to leave, and at the door he gave Smokey the release signal, and she rose to her feet without a sound, and the 2 of them walked out of the basement and up the church stairs and into the cold November night. In the parking lot, the woman from the gas station was standing by her grey Honda Civic with the boy holding her hand. She did not look at Jax. She did not move. The boy did. The boy looked. The boy looked the way only a child can look, with the whole of his attention undivided, his small face turned up toward Jax's, and his eyes wide and serious, and the boy raised one hand in a small, careful wave. Jax raised his hand back. Then the woman pulled the boy toward the car, gentle but firm, and they got in, and they drove away. And Jax stood in the church parking lot with his dog at his side and the cold settling on his shoulders. And he did not understand yet what he had just been a part of. But he would. He drove home up the mountain. He worked another 2 hours by lantern light before he slept. The eastern arch closed that night. The last voussoir before the keystone seating into its place with the small dry sound of a thing finally finding its home. And the silence after was the kind of silence Jax had not heard in a very long time. The first snow came on the 14th of November, 2 days after the town meeting, and it came not as a storm but as a kind of slow, unceasing drift. The small dry flakes that fall in northern Montana when the air is too cold to hold any real weight of moisture, and they piled themselves quietly on the wooden centering of the second arch, and on the tarp covering the mortar bucket, and on the spine of Smokey as she lay watching Jack's work. By noon the temperature had dropped to 9 degrees. By 4 in the afternoon it was at 0. By the time Jax came down off the ladder for the last time that day, it was -6 and falling, and the wind had begun to come out of the northwest in long low sweeps that pressed his jacket flat against his ribs and made his eyes water inside the lashes. He had set the last voussoir of the second arch by lantern light. The keystone of the eastern arch was already seated. The keystone of the western arch was wrapped and waiting. Between the two completed arches, the wooden centering for the long barrel vault ran the full 24-foot length of the cabin, and the stones for the vault itself were stacked outside in 3 pyramids on the granite bedrock, 212 voussoirs in all, each one cut by hand and numbered in white chalk on the face that would never be visible once the stone was in place. He had 3 weeks of work left. He had $470 in the bank. He had a propane tank that was 3/4 empty, and the next refill was going to cost him $112 at the depot in Pinedale, and the math did not add up, no matter how many ways he turned it. He sat in the trailer that night with Smokey's chin on his thigh, and the percolator on the camp stove, and the leather notebook open on the folding table, and he ran the numbers 3 times. He could not buy more propane and finish the vault. He could not finish the vault and buy more propane. He could not skip either one. The cold was already climbing through the seams of the airstream, and the heater was already running every 15 minutes instead of every 20. And if the propane ran out in the middle of a January night at 5,000 feet, he and the dog would not see morning. He closed the notebook, he drank the coffee, he watched the wall of the trailer for a long time. Then he stood up and went to the small drawer under the sink and pulled out the velvet pouch that contained his service medals, and he laid them on the table one by one, and he looked at each one in turn, and he chose the 2 that would bring the most money at the pawn shop in Great Falls, and he put those 2 in his shirt pocket, and put the other 4 back in the pouch, and put the pouch back in the drawer. Smokey watched him do this without lifting her head from the blanket. She knew what he was doing. She had watched him do it twice before. The drive to Great Falls was 168 miles, 4 hours each way on the kind of 2-lane that did not get ploughed promptly in early winter, and he and Smokey left the property at 4:30 in the morning and got back at 7:15 in the evening, with $322 in cash in the chest pocket of his jacket, and a tank full of propane, and a fresh 50-pound bag of dog food in the bed of the truck. He did not look at the empty space in the velvet pouch when he put the cash from his pocket into the coffee can with the other things on the high shelf. He did not let himself. He went back to work the next morning. The vault took him 11 days to half-build. The work was harder than any work he had ever done. The voussoirs of the long vault did not sit on a flat bed of mortar the way the voussoirs of the end arches had. They had to be fitted in pairs, one from each side, each pair set at the same time so that the thrust of one stone counterbalanced the thrust of the other against the wooden centering, and a pair set wrong would not announce the error until 3 or 4 pairs later, when the whole section above would begin to creep almost imperceptibly out of true, and then the only remedy was to take it all down and start the section over. He took down 2 sections. The second one was the worst. He had stayed up until 2 in the morning building it, and when he came back to it at dawn and saw the small shadow at the base of the 7th course that should not have been there, he sat down on the granite floor with his back against the cold stone of the wall, and he put his face in his hands, and he stayed like that for a long time, and Smokey came and lay across his thighs without making a sound, and he did not move her off, and the 2 of them stayed there until the sun cleared the ridge and threw a hard white light through the unfinished doorway, and then he stood up and took the section down and started it over. He finished the western half of the vault on the night of the 23rd of November, working alone by lantern light, in a temperature that had fallen to -11 degrees. He had not eaten since the morning. His hands were cracked at the knuckles and bleeding through the leather of his work gloves. The lantern threw his shadow up the curve of the half-finished vault in a long bent shape that moved when he moved, like a second man working alongside him, and somewhere in the small hours after midnight he began to hear things in the silence between the wind gusts. The first thing he heard was a generator misfiring. There was no generator on his property. There were no generators within 4 miles of his property. But the sound was in his ears as clearly as if a Honda EU 2200 had been running on the granite bedrock 6 feet from where he stood, and his body responded the way his body had been trained to respond, the long muscles of his thighs going tight, the breath shortening in his chest, the small, old familiar pressure beginning to climb up the back of his neck and settle behind his eyes. He set down the trowel. He put both hands flat against the cold stone of the vault. He breathed. The second thing he heard was the whoomp of something that was not there. A mortar round, a specific mortar round he had heard exactly once in his life, in a province whose name he could not say. On a morning he had spent 14 years not letting himself remember. The whoomp was the round leaving the tube. The next sound, by physics, would be the whistle of the round coming down. He knew this. His body knew this. The next sound did not come and did not come and did not come, and the silence where it should have been was worse than the sound, because his body had already made the calculation and was already crouched in a doorway in another country, and the dog beside him was not Smokey but a different dog, a dog whose name he had learned not to say, and the man on his left was not anyone, and the man on his right was. Smokey was at his elbow. She had not moved that he had seen, but she was there, her flank pressed against the outside of his left thigh, her amber eyes turned up toward his face in the lantern light, her breath coming in slow, even white clouds against the back of his hand. She did not whine, she did not bark. She leaned her full weight against his leg and held it there. And the heat of her body and the slow patient rhythm of her breathing came up through the thick canvas of his jeans and settled into his hip, and he stood there with his palms flat against the stone and his dog against his leg, and he breathed the way she was breathing, slow in and slow out, and after a long time the generator faded, and after another long time the mortar round did not whistle, and after another long time Jax Harlan was back inside his own body in his own cabin, on his own mountain in the country that had sent him to the other place, and had then forgotten his name. He sat down on the granite floor. Smokey lay beside him with her chin on his boot. He did not cry. He had not cried in 15 years, and he did not cry now. But he sat for a long time with his hand on her ribs, and felt the slow, steady mechanism of her breathing rise and fall under his palm, and he thought, not in words, but in something deeper than words, if she had not been here, if she had not been here. He did not finish the keystone of the Western Arch that night. He climbed down off the ladder and put out the lantern and walked Smokey down the path to the trailer, and he slept for 9 hours straight for the first time in 2 years. In the morning there was a small cardboard box on the granite step of the trailer. It had not been there when he had gone to bed. It was tied with a length of brown twine, and there was no name on it, and there were tyre tracks in the new powder of snow leading up the gravel road and back down again, narrow tyres, a small front-wheel drive car. He brought the box inside, he cut the twine. Inside the box there was a quart-sized mason jar of beef and barley soup, still warm from the thermos it had been transferred out of, and a paper sack of cornbread wrapped in a clean dish towel, and a small folded piece of notebook paper with a single sentence written on it in a careful hand. From a friend who saw you at the meeting. That was all. There was no name. There was no signature. He sat at the folding table with the soup in front of him and Smokey watching him from the bunk, and he did not eat it for a long time. He looked at the jar, he looked at the cornbread, he looked at the note. The handwriting was a woman's. He did not know any women in Pinedale by their handwriting. He thought of May Holloway and dismissed it, because May Holloway would have signed her name. He thought of the woman from the gas station, and his hand, of its own accord, moved to the chest pocket of his jacket where her $10 bill would have been if he had taken it. And he felt the absence there the way a man feels the absence of something he did not know he had wanted to keep. The bracelet on her wrist. The small flat metal tags. He had seen those tags before. He had worn a pair, just like them, around his own neck for 12 years. He ate the soup. It was the best food he had eaten in 9 months, and he ate it slowly, 1 spoonful at a time, with the bread torn into small pieces in his other hand. And Smokey watched him eat without begging, the way she had always watched him eat, and when he was done he washed the jar and folded the dish towel and set them both on the table, and he did not throw away the note. He put it in the coffee can on the high shelf, behind the wedding band and in front of the photograph of his mother, and he closed the lid. He went back up to the cabin. He set the keystone of the Western Arch alone in the cold light of mid-morning. The stone weighed 41 pounds. It seated in its place with the small, dry sound of a thing finally finding its home. And Jax Harlan stood at the foot of the ladder with both hands hanging at his sides, and he looked up at the closed Western Arch, and Smokey sat at his right side and looked up too, and for a moment that he could not have explained to another living soul, he felt his brother's hand on the back of his neck. He did not turn around. He knew there was no one there. He had 8 days left to set the eastern half of the vault. The forecast on the radio was calling for a low-pressure system to sweep down out of Canada the following Tuesday, with a possibility of significant accumulation. The forecast was wrong. The system was not low pressure. The system was a direct descendant of the storms that had killed cattle by the thousand in the High Line in 1888, and it was already gathering its strength over the Beaufort Sea at the precise moment Jax Harlan was lifting his trowel to begin the next day's work. He did not know that yet. Smokey did not know it either. But the wind shifted that afternoon, 2 points to the north and 1 point west, and Smokey raised her head from the granite floor where she had been resting, and held it there for a long time with her ears in a configuration Jax had not seen on her since the last day of their last deployment, and a small cold weight settled inside Jax's chest that had nothing to do with the temperature. The blizzard made landfall on the Montana High Plains at 3:47 on the afternoon of December the 2nd, and the National Weather Service in Great Falls revised its forecast at the same minute from significant winter storm to life-threatening blizzard with hurricane-force gusts, but by then it did not matter what anyone called it anymore. The first wall of snow came across the saddle of Wolf Ridge, moving at 58 miles an hour, and the temperature dropped from 12 degrees to -4 in the space of 40 minutes, and the wind chill at the top of the ridge reached -58 by sundown. The radio went out at 4:15. The power lines that ran up the gravel road from the highway came down in 3 places between 4:30 and 5, and the lights in the few outlying ranch houses on the lower slopes blinked once and went dark. And after that there was nothing in the entire Wolf Ridge Basin but the wind and the dark and the snow. Jax had finished the cabin 9 days earlier. The keystone of the long vault had set on the morning of the 23rd of November, the last stone of the central rib seating into its place at 11:42 in the morning under a thin pale winter sun, and he had stood under the closed dome with his palms flat against the cold rough granite of the spring line, and Smokey pressed against his right calf, and he had not said anything, and he had not needed to. The cabin was 20 feet by 24 feet inside. The walls were 40 inches thick at the base, tapering to 28 inches at the spring line of the vault. The vault itself rose in a barrel curve from the long walls, a rise of 9 feet at the crown, the thermal mass of the entire roof structure approaching 40,000 pounds of cut and fitted granite, resting in pure compression on its own spring line. He had built a single small wood stove against the north interior wall, vented through a stone-lined flue he had built into the wall itself, rather than through a metal pipe out the roof, and the flue ran up through the thermal mass of the western spring line, and exited through a small chimney at the crown of the gable wall. He had cured the mortar for 6 full days. He had moved the woolen blanket and the percolator and the leather notebook and the coffee can up from the trailer on the morning of the 29th of November. He and Smokey had slept in the cabin every night since. The blizzard found him stacking firewood against the north interior wall. He had 3 cords cut and split and stacked outside under an oilcloth tarp, and he was bringing the last of it inside by the armload, working against the rising wind, and Smokey was watching him from her place by the wood stove, with her amber eyes tracking each trip he made through the door. The temperature inside the cabin was a steady 63 degrees. The temperature 6 inches outside the door was -4 and falling. The thermal mass of the vault was holding its heat the way Brother Stefan had said it would hold its heat, the way the old Bosnian monk had said the kitchen vault of his monastery had held the heat through 700 winters of Balkan storms. The first knock came at 6:12. Jax had been about to bank the stove for the night. Smokey was on her feet before the second knock, her head turned toward the door, her ears in the high alert carriage, her tail neither up nor down but level along the line of her spine, the carriage of an animal who has registered a presence and is waiting for the presence to identify itself. Jax went to the door. He cracked it 6 inches against the wind. It was a man he did not know. He was 50 years old, maybe older, dressed in a Carhartt jacket that was already half-coated in driven snow, his beard frozen white along the edges of his mouth, his face the colour of raw chicken under the rime of ice on his eyebrows. He had a woman with him, his wife by the look of her, and a girl of perhaps 12. They stood on the granite step, and they did not speak. They did not need to speak. The man's eyes spoke. The eyes said, "I do not know you, and I know what I said about you, and I am asking." Jax opened the door the rest of the way. "Get inside." They came inside. He closed the door behind them. The wind cut off the way the wind always cut off when a man came in from a storm. The three of them stood in the middle of the granite floor, and they shook the snow off their coats, and they did not say anything. And the daughter began to cry without sound, the small choked tears of a child who has been told all the way up the mountain that she is not allowed to cry. And the woman put her hand on the girl's shoulder, and the girl turned her face into the woman's coat. The man looked at Jax, and he opened his mouth to say something, and he closed it again. He nodded once. He went to the stove. The second knock came at 6:28. 2 more families, 7 people, one of them an elderly woman who was already in the early stages of hypothermia. And Jax helped her down to the granite floor near the stove, and helped the woman with her get her coat off, and helped pile the spare wool blankets around her, and Smokey lay down beside the elderly woman without being asked. Her thick double coat against the woman's left side, and the woman's daughter began to cry then for the first time. A soft, choked, exhausted sound, and Jack stepped back and let them be. The third knock came at 6:51. By then there were 14 people in the cabin, and the wood stove was roaring, and the temperature inside had risen to 68, despite the door being opened and closed 5 times in the last 40 minutes, because the thermal mass of the vault was still giving back the heat it had absorbed across 9 days of careful firing. And the granite floor itself was warm enough through Jax's boots to feel against the soles of his feet. He opened the door. Vance Crowley stood on the granite step. His county truck had not made it the full 11 miles up the gravel road. He had walked the last 3. His hands were bare and grey, his left ear was white. He had a 32-year-old man Jax did not know slung over his right shoulder in a fireman's carry, the man semi-conscious, blood frozen along the side of his face from a gash above his left eyebrow. Crowley did not say anything. His mouth was too cold to form words. His eyes did not meet Jax's. They went to the floor and stayed there. Jax took the man off Crowley's shoulder. He laid him on the granite by the stove. He turned back to Crowley and put his hand under Crowley's elbow and walked him to the wall and sat him down against it. And the inspector lowered himself to the floor like a man whose strings had been cut, and he sat there with his back against the warm granite, and he closed his eyes and his shoulders began to shake. Jax did not speak to him. He brought a wool blanket and laid it over Crowley's lap. He brought a tin mug of coffee off the stove and set it in Crowley's hands, and he had to fold the inspector's fingers around the handle himself because the inspector's fingers had stopped knowing how to hold things. Crowley did not look at him. Crowley did not say thank you. Crowley sat against the wall and shook quietly, and after a long time he raised the mug to his mouth and drank. By 8 in the evening there were 23 people in the cabin. The 40,000 pounds of granite vault was now radiating heat into the air around it, the way a soaked stone in a sauna radiates heat. And the people who had come in shivering at -6 were now warm enough to take off their outer coats, and the children had begun to fall asleep in clusters on the spare blankets that Jax had pulled from every storage box in the trailer before the wind had made another trip down impossible. He had a soup pot of beans and bacon on the stove. He had 3 loaves of cornbread baking in a cast-iron Dutch oven set into the coals. He had given up his bunk, his blankets, his pillows, his mattress, and the coat off his own back. He stood now at the door of the cabin in his shirt-sleeves with Smokey beside him, watching the storm through the small frosted glass of the door window, and the storm was worse than anything he had seen in Montana in his entire life. The woman from the gas station had come in with the second wave. She had come in with her son. Jax had seen her at the door, and had stepped aside without speaking, and she had come past him without looking up, and the boy had looked up the way a boy looks up, the same wave of one small hand that he had given in the church parking lot, and the boy had gone to Smokey and laid his palm flat on the top of her head, and Smokey had let him do it without moving, and the woman had taken her place against the eastern wall with the boy beside her, and a wool blanket across both their laps, and she had not spoken to Jax, and Jax had not spoken to her, and the bracelet on her wrist had caught the firelight every time she moved her arm. It was 9:14 when Smokey stood up. She did it slowly. She did it deliberately. She rose from the spot where she had been lying for 40 minutes between the elderly woman and the wood stove, and she stretched her front legs once, and she walked across the granite floor of the cabin in a straight line that did not deviate by an inch. She walked to the woman from the gas station. She stopped 6 inches in front of the woman's bent knees. She lowered her muzzle to the woman's hands, which were folded in her lap on top of the wool blanket, and she sniffed once, slowly, the long, careful inhalation of a working dog reading information out of the air. Then she raised her head and she looked the woman directly in the eyes. She held the look. She did not blink. The woman froze. The whole cabin went quiet by degrees. The way the church basement had gone quiet when Jax had walked in, the silence rippling outward from the woman and the dog, until the only sound was the wind against the granite and the fire in the stove. Smokey turned her head. She looked at the door. She turned her head back. She looked at the woman. She did this 3 times. On the 3rd time the woman whispered a single word. Eli. She looked beside her. The wool blanket was empty. The boy was not there. The woman's hands flew to her mouth. The cabin began to move. People sitting up. People looking around. The murmur of 23 voices realizing at the same moment that the 7-year-old boy who had been in the cabin 20 minutes earlier was no longer in the cabin. Jax was already moving. He was at the door. He was pulling on his jacket. He was shoving his feet into his boots. "How long?" he said. The woman could not answer. She was already on her feet, her face the colour of bone. The boy's wool blanket held in her hand like she did not know what to do with it. "How long since you saw him?" Jax said. "He said he wanted to see the dog," her voice broke. "He was right next to me. I closed my eyes for 1 minute. Oh God, I'll find him. I'm coming with you. You will die in that storm. I will find him. Smokey will find him. Stay here." He did not wait for her to argue. He pulled the door open. The wind hit him like a freight train. The visibility outside was less than 4 feet. The cold was beyond cold, a thing past description, a thing that took the breath out of his chest before he could finish drawing it in. Smokey was through the door before he was. She did not hesitate. She did not look back. She went straight out into the white, her amber eyes already locked on something Jax could not see, her body low to the snow, her thick double coat already collecting the driven flakes along the spine in a thin growing line. Jax went after her. The world outside the door was a single roaring white wall. He could not see the path, he could not see the trailer, he could not see the truck. He could not see his own hands when he held them in front of his face. He could see Smokey just barely, a darker shape moving ahead of him in the white, and he kept her in sight by an act of pure attention. And he followed her down off the granite shelf and across what he thought was the path and around what he thought was the trailer. And he put one hand on his belt where he had clipped a 30-foot length of paracord before he had stepped through the door, and he played the cord out behind him as he went. Smokey stopped after 80 feet. She did not bark. She lowered her muzzle to the snow. She moved 3 steps to the left. She lowered her muzzle again. She moved 2 steps further. She stopped. She lay down. She lay down on top of something. Jax got to her. He went to his knees in the snow. The drift was 4 feet deep at that spot, blown up against the leeward side of a stone outcropping that broke the wind, and Smokey was lying flat across the surface of the drift, with her head on her front paws and her body stretched out long, and she was lying on top of the small dark shape of a child's coat that Jax could just see emerging from the snow under her chest. He dug with both hands, and he did not stop. He cleared the snow away from the boy's face first, the way he had been trained to clear an avalanche burial, and the boy's face was blue-grey and his eyelids were half closed and his lips were the colour of slate. But there was a small white plume of breath coming out of the boy's nostrils every 3 seconds, and that was enough. That was everything. That was the difference between coming back with a child and coming back with a body. Smokey stayed on top of the boy until Jax had cleared the snow from the boy's torso and legs. She did not move. Her body was the only thing that had been keeping the boy's chest cavity warm for the 18 minutes he had been buried. Then Jax got his arms under the boy, and Smokey rolled off, and Jax stood up with the boy across his forearms, and the boy was small, smaller than Jax had remembered him being, and the weight of him was almost nothing in Jax's arms. He turned. The cord was still in his belt. He followed it back. Smokey followed at his right side, her flank against his thigh, her body breaking the wind for him and for the boy at the same time. 80 feet, 60-40. The cabin was a darker shape in the white, and then it was a wall, and then it was the door, and the door was open, and the woman was standing in the door with her hands pressed flat against her mouth. And Jax pushed past her without speaking, and laid the boy on the wool blanket beside the stove, and Smokey lay down beside the boy, and the woman dropped to her knees next to her son, and put her face against the side of his face, and she did not make a sound for a long time, and then she made every sound at once. The cabin was completely silent except for the woman. Vance Crowley was on his feet. He had the wool blanket off his lap. He took it across the room and laid it across the woman's shoulders. May Holloway, who had come up the mountain in the second wave, took the boy's small cold hands between her own, and began to chafe them slowly, the way a grandmother chafes the hands of a child who has come in from the cold. 2 of the other men brought a third blanket from the corner. The elderly woman, who had been hypothermic herself, sat up against the wall and reached out and put one frail hand on Smokey's spine, and the dog turned her head and met the old woman's eyes, and they held the look between them for a beat that no one else in the room saw. And then Smokey turned her head back to the boy and laid her muzzle along the boy's small still arm, and the boy's eyelids fluttered once, and then he opened his eyes. He looked up. His mother was the first thing he saw. Mama. She was crying too hard to answer. Jax stood at the door. He had not moved from the doorway since he had set the boy down. His shirt was soaked through with blown snow. His hands were shaking. He could feel them shaking even though he could not feel them otherwise. Smokey lifted her head from the boy's arm and looked across the room at him, and her amber eyes held his for a long moment, and the look in them was the same look she had given him that night in the unfinished cabin when the generator had been misfiring that was not there. "You are not alone. I have you. Breathe," he breathed. The wind howled against the granite vault above them, and the granite vault held. The 40,000 pounds of fitted stone over their heads did not move, did not creak, did not shift. The thermal mass radiated. The fire burned. 23 souls and 1 dog and 1 rescued boy lay in the warmth of a building the entire valley had said could not stand, and the storm outside pulled trailers off their blocks and tore the roofs off 3 of the homes those 23 souls had abandoned. And the thing that Jax Harlan had built with his hands and his brother's notebook, and an 81-year-old Bosnian monk's geometry held its silence above them like a hand cupped around a candle. The night was long. The blizzard did not slow down until 5 in the morning, and even then it did not stop, only settled into a steady dense fall that the wind no longer drove sideways, and the temperature outside the granite walls held at -11 degrees, while the temperature inside the cabin, with 24 bodies and 1 wood stove and 40,000 pounds of heat-storing stone, climbed slowly from 68 to 72 and held there. Children slept in piles on the wool blankets. The elderly woman against the wall slept with her hand still resting on Smokey's spine, and Smokey did not move her hand off her, and at some point in the small hours the dog's eyes closed for the first time in 18 hours, and she slept, and Jax Harlan watched her sleep from his place by the door, and felt something inside his chest unclench by half an inch. Vance Crowley came over to where Jax was sitting at 3 in the morning. He sat down beside him on the granite floor with his back against the wall, and he did not say anything for a long time. His hands were wrapped around a cooling tin mug of coffee. His face was no longer the colour of raw chicken. He had eaten a piece of cornbread an hour earlier, and he had kept it down. He looked older than he had looked the day he had stood in the parking lot of the church and watched the vote come back 3-0. "My father," Crowley said. Jax did not answer. He waited. "My father was a Korean War veteran, came home in 55, worked the section of railroad between Havre and Shelby for 31 years. He bought a single-wide trailer in 1968 and put it up on a half-acre east of town, and that was the only home he ever owned. The insulation was bad. It was always bad. He patched it every winter. He put up plastic sheeting on the inside of the windows. He kept a kerosene heater going in the kitchen. In February of 1989, the kerosene heater ran out in the middle of the night, and he did not wake up to refill it, and the temperature inside the trailer dropped to 14 degrees, and my father had emphysema by then, and his lungs froze. He was looking at the floor. He was not looking at Jax. I was 26 years old when they found him. I was a junior structural engineer at the firm in Bozeman. I had been telling him for 4 years that the trailer was not safe and that he should let me build him a real house on the land, with proper insulation and proper heat, and he would not let me do it. He said the trailer was good enough. He said a man who has slept in foxholes does not need a house with insulation. He said it was his life and his choice, and I said it was a bad choice, and he said it was his to make. Crowley took a drink of the coffee. The drink shook in his hand. I took the building inspector's job in Blackfoot County in 1991. I have held it for 33 years. I have red-tagged 746 structures in that time. I have shut down 411. I have, as best I can count, prevented 12 deaths in the last 3 decades by shutting down structures before they killed the people in them. I have done my job. I have done my job. He looked up at Jax for the first time. And I came up your mountain 3 times to do it again, because I thought I knew what I was looking at, and I thought you were my father, and I thought I was going to come up here in the spring and find you frozen to death under your own roof. And I sat in this room tonight, Mr. Harlan, with my back against your wall, and I felt this stone radiating heat at me through the back of my coat, and I watched the wind take houses I had personally inspected and signed off on. And I thought to myself that I have spent 33 years learning everything they teach you about what holds a building up, and I have never seen anything in my life as warm and as quiet and as alive as this room you have built. He stopped. He looked down at the coffee. I'm sorry, he said. I am sorry. Jax did not say anything for a long moment. Then he reached over and put his hand on Vance Crowley's shoulder, and he kept it there for a count of 3. And he took it off, and that was the answer, and Crowley understood it. And Crowley nodded once and looked down at his coffee, and did not speak again. The woman from the gas station came over at 4 in the morning. The boy was asleep in her lap with his head against her chest and Smokey's body tucked against his right side. The woman sat down on the granite floor next to Jax in the spot Crowley had vacated, and she pulled her wool blanket around her shoulders and her son's, and she did not look at Jax's face. My name is Cora, she said. I should have said that before. I know, he said. Cora Walsh. He did not answer. The name moved through the air between them and did not land yet. The way a stone moves through water and does not strike the bottom for a long moment after it has left the surface, and Jax felt the absence of the bottom before he felt the bottom. Walsh. My husband was a Marine, Cora said. He was killed in Helmand in 2011. His name was Daniel. Jax did not move. He did not speak. His hand, of its own accord, moved to his chest pocket where the leather notebook was not, because the leather notebook was on the high shelf inside the trailer that was now buried up to its window line in snow. But his hand went there anyway, and rested there, and did not come back. Daniel told me about a man, Cora said. He told me about him in every letter he wrote home for 2 years. He said this man was the best man he had ever served with. He said this man had pulled him out of a collapsed building in Bosnia in the winter of 2010 and had carried him 3 miles through a snowstorm to a Bosnian Orthodox monastery, and that the monk who lived there had taken them in, and that the 3 of them had spent 3 nights in that monastery talking about stones and arches and the way the old men in that country had built things to last. Daniel said when he came home, when this whole thing was over, he was going to build a house like that monastery. He said he was going to build it for me. He said the man who had pulled him out of the building had told him he would help. He said the man's name was Jax Harlan. She said the name slowly. She let it settle. Daniel was killed 2 months before he was supposed to come home. The Marines sent me a flag and a box of his personal effects and the dog tags he had been wearing, and that was all I had. I never met you. I never saw a photograph. I knew you were called Jax, and I knew you were called Harlan, and I knew you were from California somewhere, and that was every piece of information I had about the man my husband had loved more than he had loved his own brother. I could not find you. I tried for 2 years. I gave up. She lifted her wrist from her son's shoulder. The bracelet caught the firelight. The small flat metal tags rested against her skin. "I made this from his tags," she said. "I have worn it every day for 12 years. Jax could see the engraving now. Walsh, Daniel R., USMC. The blood type. The service number. "I moved to Pinedale 4 years ago," Cora said. "My mother grew up here. After her funeral I came to clean out her house, and I stayed. I work at the diner. I did not know there was a Jax Harlan in this county. I did not know it was you. I did not know until tonight." She paused. She looked at the dog asleep against her son. "When she came across the room to me," she said, "when she looked at me, I knew. I knew from the way she looked at me. I do not know how I knew. I knew." Jax found his voice. It was not where he had left it. He had to wait for it to come back to him. "He talked about you," he said. "He talked about you every night. He had a photograph of you in his helmet liner. He showed it to me the day before he died. He said you were the only home he had ever had, and he said when he got back he was going to build you a stone house with a vault for a roof, the way the old men in that country had done it. He said you would understand when you saw it. He said the stone would be the proof of how much he had loved you." She was crying. She was crying without sound, the tears running down her face and not being wiped away. And the boy in her lap was still asleep, and Smokey was awake again now, watching them both with her amber eyes steady and ancient. And Jax could not say anything else for a long moment because his own throat had closed. "I have his notebook," he said finally. "I have the drawings he made. I have the geometry. I have everything he wrote. It is in the trailer. When the storm clears, I will give it to you." "No," she said. Her voice was small. "Don't give it to me. Keep it. He would have wanted you to keep it. You are the one who knew what to do with it." She put her hand on his hand. Her hand was still cold. He did not pull away. "Daniel was right about you," she said. "Everything he said about you. He was right." Jax could not speak. He nodded once. He put his other hand over her hand, and he held it there for a count of 3 the way he had held Crowley's shoulder, and he took it off, and Cora pulled the wool blanket back around her son and herself, and she leaned her head against the granite wall behind her, and she closed her eyes, and she did not open them again until the dawn. The dawn came at 7:14 on the morning of December the 3rd. The wind had stopped completely, the snow had stopped. The sun came up over Wolf Ridge on a world that was unrecognizable, a world buried 4 feet deep on the flats and 12 feet deep in the drifts, a world in which entire houses had been blown off their foundations and the wreckage was already covered, a world in which the only thing standing on the lower slope of the mountain was Jax Harlan's stone-vaulted cabin, the chimney still smoking thinly, the roof still holding, the door still closed. The county snowplow did not reach the gravel road until 2 in the afternoon. The first National Guard helicopter did not land in the meadow below Jax's property until 4. By then the 23 people in the cabin had been fed twice, and the elderly woman's colour had come back, and Eli had eaten 3 pieces of cornbread, and had drunk a mug of warm milk, and had fallen asleep again with his head on Smokey's flank, and Vance Crowley had taken off his coat and his gloves, and his outer flannel shirt, and had spent 2 hours helping Jax bring more firewood up from the buried tarp on the granite shelf, and Cora had stood at the window with her hand against the cold glass, and had not said much of anything for a long time, but had looked back at Jax once across the warm room, and had given him the smallest nod that any human being had ever given another, and the nod had been enough. When the helicopter came, they sent the elderly woman out first. They took the children next. The man with the gash above his eyebrow went out on the 2nd flight. By the 3rd flight, only Cora and Eli and Vance Crowley were left, and Crowley had refused to leave until everyone else was on the ground in Pinedale, because he was the building inspector for Blackfoot County, and these were his people, and Cora had refused to leave until he did, because she had something she wanted to say to Jax that she had not yet said. She said it at the door, with Eli holding her hand and the sound of the helicopter rotors thumping down the slope behind her. "Come down, when you're ready. Come down and meet us properly." He looked at her. He looked at the boy. "I will," he said. She went out. Eli went out. Crowley went last. He stopped at the threshold and turned back, and he looked at Jax across the warm cabin, and he did not say anything, but he extended his hand, and Jax took it, and they shook once, and Crowley nodded the way men nodded at one another, and went out into the snow. Jax closed the door. The cabin was silent. Smoky walked across the granite floor and pressed her flank against his thigh and looked up at him with her amber eyes, and Jax laid his hand on the top of her head, and the two of them stood at the door of the cabin Daniel Walsh had drawn in pencil in a Firebase notebook in 2010, and the cabin held its heat, and the cabin held its silence, and outside the small frosted window the world that had spent 11 months calling the cabin a tomb was beginning the long, slow process of digging itself out from under what it had survived only because the tomb had let them in. Spring came late that year. The last snow on the north face of Wolf Ridge did not melt off until the 3rd week of May, and the wildflowers along the gravel road did not open until the 1st week of June. And on a Sunday afternoon in early June, Cora Walsh drove her grey Honda Civic up the 11 miles of switchback gravel with Eli in the passenger seat, and a Pyrex dish of pot roast on the floorboard between his feet. And she parked at the head of the path, and she walked up to the cabin with her son's hand in hers. Jax met them at the door. He had a beard that was newly trimmed. He was wearing a clean flannel shirt. Smoky stood at his right side with her ears in the soft carriage of welcome that she now used only for the two of them. Ellie ran the last 10 feet and threw his small arms around the dog's neck, and Smoky's tail thumped once, slowly, against the granite step. Inside the cabin, the wood stove was cold for the first time in 7 months. The early summer sun came through the small east window in a long, slow slant of gold light, and the light fell on the keystone of the central rib of the vault, and from the keystone hung a single thin strip of rawhide, and from the rawhide hung a pair of stainless steel dog tags, the engraving worn smooth in places, the chain replaced once. Cora saw them. She stopped. Her hand went to her mouth. "He should be home," Jax said. She did not answer. She walked across the granite floor and stood beneath the keystone, and she looked up, and Eli came and stood beside her and looked up too, and Smoky walked across the room and lay down on the warm granite at their feet, and Jax stood by the door with his hands at his sides and did not interrupt. After a long while Cora turned. Her eyes were wet. She did not wipe them. "Will you come down for supper sometime?" "Jax." "I will. Bring her. Always. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today.